Well, hello. This will be the third part of my analysis of the poem Earthy, uh, Earthy Anecdote by Wallace Stevens. Now, I said many things in the previous two parts, but I realized that I haven't given a thesis statement or really presented much of a structurally sound essay in which I provided an introduction. Um, and I guess that's a function of the fact that I'm reading it line by line. And I guess I wanted these videos to be somehow um, to exemplify the immediacy of the impact that the poem's having upon me and how I'm processing the poem in real time, as well as a strong structural sound evaluation of them. So if you see here, I've broken down the poem into the one, two, and three, and the the first three paragraphs, I call that interaction. It's the interaction and maybe the causal relationships between the bucks and the red cat. Sorry, the fire cat. Two, as I'll be talking about, is that I perceive a separation between the two of them. That first we introduce the bucks, and then we merely talk about, or mostly merely talk about, explicitly talk about the fire cat. And then the last couplet, if you can call it that, that last fragment, is an extraction of the fire cat the um, from the interaction. I do come from a physical science background, so this kind of represents my particular perspective in viewing matter in terms of its classification. And the only way that matter can be classified is in the physical setting, is in the setting where we can separate this from that, and to purify, to remove one substance from a mixture of substance, which is the only way that a substance can be established as being pr- uh, primary and not secondary, as a mixture might be. So in this stanza, it says that the bucks clattered. If you notice, this is in contrast to the um, bucks going clattering, or in the past tense, the bucks went clattering. Now, as I said earlier, that when we say that we went Xing, that almost suggests conscious entities having agency over what they do, planning, having intention over things that they intend for the future. Again, as I said, if I go skiing or went skiing, I skied, but not just because I happened to find myself on on a slope at that moment and gave free rein to my downward tending instincts and rode the trail downward. No, I knew of these things. I had a picture, a mental picture of the mountains in my mind, and I fashioned skis, or I bought skis, and I went with my friends, and we went downhill together by plan. We went skiing. If we say that the bucks clattered, is that really so fundamentally different than saying the teacups clattered in the cabinet when the tremor shook the room? It really rather turns the bucks into objects that are recipients from forces outside and act under their control in the same way that a tremor will animate uh, the, uh, the the teacups in a cabinet. Now, while the bucks are now being talked about in the simple past, it's now the fire cat who gains this complex motion of went leaping. So, in this way, at the very least, they mirror the kind of motion that was suggested or that characterized the bucks earlier on, the earlier one in which they went clattering. So, whereas earlier the bucks went clattering, now the fire cat went leaping to the right, to the left, and bristled in the way. So not only does it mirror the motion of the bucks, that whereas the bucks went clattering, the fire cat went leaping, it's now leaping in the same directions that the fire cat, there what the bucks went. Just as the bucks swerved to the left or to the right, the fire cat went leaping to the right, to the left. Now, I have to say, the phrase went leaping doesn't quite sound right. It feels like a little bit of taking liberties with usage. Um, when we talk about went leaping, again, we can talk about the went Xing, in which there is an agency, a plan to do something. Now, when we talk about fire cats, when we talk about cats, cats do leap. But I really, have, in my life, have never used the phrase went leaping or have heard that it went leaping. Of course, it suggests the following, that something happened that caused the cat to leap. But in that case, we really would just say the cat leapt. Now, actually, what this suggested to me in terms of the sound, the cat went flying. Now, that's usage. That's something that we would say. And actually, although it doesn't explicitly happen in the poem, if we say that something went flying, it means that an object or a thing, upon receiving the impact of something larger, went into flight. It left the ground and landed somewhere else. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is when leaping and when flying have the same trajectory and the same shape of trajectory. You start at a point and you wind after traveling a curve at another point. Now, if I say went leaping, that suggests that anything that leaps has some agency, that it has some control. It decides when it's going to take to the air and then leave itself to fall down. If you went flying, obviously, you have no control over where you're going to end. But it's the same essential trajectory. The only difference is that went leaping is something we would actually, went flying is something that's actually something we can say, whereas went leaping, at least to me, that's not really usage, although some might argue. In fact, sometimes I feel like I'm torn between saying that's acceptable and not, but really not. I just haven't heard it before. Now, as I speak about this, when I think about the trajectory of a leap or something that has gone flying, it also is going to follow a circular line. When you jump under the influence of gravity, you leap, but then the force of gravity will pull you down in a curve, in a circular line. So, in this respect, it also creates a certain mirroring with the previous stanza. There's also the very mirroring of, in the same way that the fire cat went leaping to the right and to the left, the bucks went, or the bucks swerved to the right and to the left as well. But that symmetry is belied by an asymmetry, whereas the fire cat leaping to the left and to the right is internally symmetrical, i.e., is a mirror image. There is no mirror image here, unless, of course, well, no, there's no mirror image whatsoever right here. If there were a mirror image between buck one and buck two, what I would see is that when it jumped to this one jumped to the right, this one would jump to the left. Remember, right and right are relative to the perspectives of the individual bucks. Now, in addition, it is said in the earlier part of the poem that it swerved to the right or to the left because of the fire cat. We don't know because of what the cat leaps. Now, we might make an assumption, a reasonable assumption, that if something went jumping or went leaping, it's because of something that it had encountered. So perhaps there is the bucks that are clattering toward it, and the fire cat loses hope and loses its position and then flies off. But again, we don't have any certain explanation or description um, uh, or acknowledgement that indeed that the fire cat is leaping because of the bucks. So here I add because of the bucks question mark. But of course, let's firmly state the two pieces of evidence that lead us to suggest that there is something about the Bucks. First, the very fact that the Bucks clatter. That's the first sentence of this particular stanza. So, although we're talking about a separation of the Fire Cat from the Bucks, they're still together. So, obviously, the Bucks are playing a role. In addition, there is the carryover of the fact that the Fire Cat bristles. The Fire Cat is not yet free of its bristling, and the bristling, why does a cat bristle? It's because of something that's alarming to it that comes out of its surroundings, and surprises it, and it reacts to instinctively. So because of these two things, we still have to take the Bucks as a reality in the life of the fire cat in this poem. But what if we're not able to say what it is? What if we're not able to, as I think we're not really fully able to, say that it's simply because of the Bucks? It's ambiguous. So then what could it be? Well, when you look at the trajectory of a leap is not just because a leap is a leap. A leap is because of an obstacle in its path. For example, if you've ever watched a cat walking along and come up to a barrier, what does it do? It jumps over it, or it leaps over that barrier, and it creates that particular trajectory that we call a leap. The question is, what might that obstacle be? So, what are these unnamed and merely implied obstacles? When I think of the clinamen, if indeed Stevens is referring to Epicurus's analysis, perhaps these could be candidates for the uncaused cause that makes the particles move away from their determined downward trajectory and gives them the possibility to collide into something and to make form and to engage in what I might call world creating, or at least be the thing that's responsible for the creation of the forms that we encounter in the space around us, the forms that we acknowledge, and without which the world could not be would not be recognizable or remotely intelligible. Now, again, coming from the physical sciences, when I think of separation, I think of a mixture. I think of perhaps sand and water, and we've shaken them up, or even a snow globe. And when we've shaken them up, of course, everything appears to be homogeneous, equally spread out. But as we notice over time, there's an inherent separation that occurs without us having to do anything. And once all is settled, well, then you have the water and the sand separated from each other. But then in this, there isn't a perfect separation that happens. Even in a physical setting, there's still the water that's touching the level of the sand, and there's still some sympathy, to use that ancient term, which we can't ultimately overcome through analysis. Again, I addressed all of the things that were symmetrical or repetitions, things that the Firecat and the Bucks had in common in terms of their trajectories. But then we saw that their trajectories were not mirror images of one another, because really the Firecat's implied jumps or explicit jumps Crash did create a symmetry, a mirror image, whereas when we thought back to the swerves together did not form a mirror image. So there are all those things that sort of undermine the coherence of the two. That we do see a separation from the two in terms of I guess to use a term, on a phenomenological basis. However, what might seem to, I don't know if I'll use the word undermine, process of separation is the fact that just as before, the fire cat bristled in the way. A bristling shows an opposition to an alarm that strikes up, and that alarm has not abated from earlier to later. So whatever it was earlier in the poem persists to later in the poem. Now, perhaps this is just a moment in separation. Perhaps this bristling will too be overcome and then allow us to separate the fire cat its from that other material, from the fire cats with which it interacted. Perhaps if it did interact, the bucks interacted with it. There's really no doubt about that. But the question is whether or not the fire cat was even aware of the presence of these bucks. Perhaps we could say, tentatively, that the fire cat is the gist. I think of William Carlos Williams' The Radiant Gist, the thing that you separate from the muck, as Curie separated or purified the radioactivity, the radium that sat on her bedside as she died of its influence from the cancer that it caused in her. Now, I'm talking about what the bucks and the fire cat have in common, and what I suggest is that it is fire that binds the two of them together, but in very different ways. Now, when we talk about the bucks in the rutting season, we're talking about a symbolic fire, that drive within them to procreate, and on the way to procreating, to uh, um, contest the right of others to mate with the does by entering into combat, which I guess you could say borders on blind rage, if not blind rage, where the buck puts everything else to the side and just stares down, focuses down on its opposing buck, and attempts to destroy it essentially, to shatter it, to cast it aside, even at great risk to itself, so that it can clear the field. And I, I'm rather otherwise fairly ignorant about the particularities about the rutting season, but I'm pretty sure that the one buck wants to banish the other, so it can be the last buck standing and be the last buck who is free to breed with all does in its area. By contrast, fire is merely referential. It is the basis of a comparison. Um, it is the real thing, the thing from the world, against which the exterior, this the surface of the cat is compared. If you wanted to say, perhaps, well, that's look at that cat. That has quite an unusual red-orange color. What would you liken that to? I'd liken it to fire, particularly as it's bristling. The fire cat is bristling, so the bristles are like the flames of the fire flickering and licking upward. So fire binds both of these two things together, even though its use in both of them, it's applied symbolically in one and referentially in the other. And on the last part that I term the extraction of the red cat from this mixture, from this contest, from this competition, um, from this wildness, I guess. Later, the fire cat closed his bright eyes and slept. Well, I mean, superficially, if we just read the lines, someone casually would just say, well, the cat was plum tuckered and just finally was overcome with fatigue and slept. But I mean, why talk about something that's fairly obvious? All biological organisms, after a period of exertion, are going to need to sleep. And so, why does the anecdote end with sleeping, which is the way that the day of every organic entity ends in sleep? And I guess allows the organism to rebound from the day's exertions, and then with bright eyes anew the next day to do it again. Well, for one, we notice that the firecat doesn't merely close his eyes and sleep. The firecat closes bright eyes. Now, when I think of bright eyes, at the very least, I think of alertness. I also think perhaps of intelligence, of perceptiveness. At the very least, anything with bright eyes is not ready to lay down to sleep. So, is this an absurdity? Well, maybe, but let's ask the question first. Under what circumstances would a creature close its bright eyes? In other words, under what circumstances will we will our eyes closed? Well, one thing that occurs to me is to avoid seeing the unpleasant or threatening when we see that we can do nothing about it. In other words, when we accept our fate, however, we can't come to terms with it really, and we have to close our eyes. Or maybe it's an incomplete acceptance of our fate. Or maybe less direly, simply to engage our mind's eye and imagination or recollection. So if I'm trying to picture someone's face, I'm probably going to close my eyes and let on the canvas of my mind a picture being painted so that what I see doesn't interfere with it. Or to evoke a memory, again, likewise, I maybe want to see something that doesn't quite resemble or is maybe out of keeping, out of phase with the very thing that I behold in my immediacy. So very simply, this line is very willful up until the point we say "and slept." Because sleep is that place beyond will. It's what swallows will. Sleeping is a kind of oblivion. It's the very sort of oblivion in which the animal lives, particularly an animal that is blind with rage or blind with lust. Again, in under the earthy conditions that the bucks are subject to. There is no will, there is simply a drive that propels them onward. And I tend to think because Stevens draws so much attention to use versus usage, if he simply used proper usage with no deviations, in a sense we would sleepwalk through the poem with without any disturbance. We wouldn't bump into anything. There would be no collision. There would be no unpleasantness that would make us think, that doesn't sound right. And so we would pass through the poem in a sleepwalking means. But Stevens is not that sort of writer. He wouldn't be a great writer if he were. And so we continually stumble upon his use with our knowledge of usage. So it's not possible to sleep uh, through one of Stevens' poems. Although at the very end, obviously, despite our willfulness, be, 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 in spite of our rebelliousness, or I said in another analysis where we're the conservative forces, we're the police who are objecting to the rebellion in the street. So in a real sense, the willfulness is on Stephen's parts, and we come through as these conservative agents who want to quell the violence. We want to reduce everything back to its quiescent state. We want everything to go to sleep. Or at best, we can say we want to face that eventual sleep with with our with a with our eyes open, with our eyes bright. We want to close our eyes and challenge sleep, perhaps. We want to oppose the oblivion that I guess you could say in which the the wild world, the animals function in. We don't want to be merely subject to the blind rages. We want to be aware of we want to be aware till the very last possible moment of entering oblivion. And I guess that's where I would end the poem. That's where I end the analysis of the poem. There's something, I don't know if I want to say tragic or maybe absurd, maybe funny. We'll leave it at funny. In the same way that it's funny that a red that a red cat could face down the galloping, blind, mad, enraged buck on its course to collide with another. Well, there's more than I could say perhaps about the poem, but I'm fairly satisfied with my reading of it up till now. Thank you for watching, and bye bye.